August 14th, 2018. Chris Watts stands outside his Frederick, Colorado home and gives a televised interview pleading for his missing family to come home. He appears concerned. He tears up on camera. He says he just wants them back safe. His wife and daughters have been dead for 36 hours. He knows exactly where the bodies are. Shanann buried in a shallow grave at the oil site where he works. Bella and Celeste forced through 8-inch hatches into crude oil storage tanks. His neighbor's surveillance camera captured him loading the truck that morning, backing into the garage, the bodies already inside. And here's the part that makes this case impossible to forget. His daughters were alive during the drive to that oil field. Bella watched her father kill her little sister. Her last words, documented in his own confession, were, "Please, Daddy, don't do to me what you just did to Cece." She was 4 years old. She knew what was happening, and he did it anyway. So here's the question this case actually asks. Everyone who knew Chris Watts described him the same way. No temper, easygoing, wouldn't hurt a fly. His own mother used those exact words to defend him after he pleaded guilty. How does someone go from that to this? We're going to walk through exactly how this happened. Not just the timeline, the psychological architecture. Because the thing that made Chris Watts capable of this wasn't built the night Shanann came home. It was built across decades. And the warning signs everyone missed? They looked like virtues. August 13th, 2018, 1:48 in the morning. Shanann Watts comes through the front door of the family home at 2825 Saratoga Trail in Frederick, Colorado. She's returning from a business trip to Arizona, a Lavelle Thrive MLM event. Her friend and colleague Nicole Atkinson drops her off. Shanann is 34, 15 weeks pregnant with a son she and Chris have already named Nico. She's built her public identity around the Thrive business, an active social media presence documenting family life, product endorsements, domestic happiness. Her friends describe someone energetic, devoted to her daughters, fiercely invested in building a family life. Bella is 4. Her nickname is Bells. Celeste, Cece, is 3. They're asleep upstairs. Chris is waiting. And by his own account, given months later in letters written from prison, he's been planning what happens next for weeks. That last detail is worth sitting with for a second, because what it means is that for weeks, while appearing in Shanann's social media content, while cohabiting with a pregnant wife and 2 small children, while going to work at Anadarko Petroleum every day, Chris Watts was cognitively rehearsing a murder. Not in a moment of rage, not as a fantasy he'd never act on, as a plan he had already committed to. The performance of normal life was running parallel to a decision that had already been made. So who is this person? Chris and Shanann married in November 2012 in North Carolina. The family moved to Colorado, bought a 5-bedroom home in Frederick. From the outside, the life looks solid. 2 kids, a tight social circle through Shanann's Thrive network, the kind of family that posts holiday photos and gender reveal videos. Chris was born in Spring Lake, North Carolina in 1985, raised in Fayetteville. His developmental history, documented primarily by therapist Lena Derhally in her book My Daddy is a Hero, shows a specific pattern: reserved, introverted, preferred to keep to himself. His sister Jamie was the social butterfly. Chris was the quiet counterpart. His relationship with his father Ronnie was strong. Ronnie functioned as a hero figure, a confidant. But Ronnie's manner was described as unemotional, and that modeling matters, because what Chris learned wasn't how to process emotion, it was how to suppress it. His relationship with his mother Cindy was notably distant. The asymmetry is clinically significant. Strong identification with an unemotional father, emotional distance from the mother. That's a setup for dismissive, avoidant attachment, relationships characterized by surface compliance and emotional unavailability beneath it. But the most important feature of Chris's childhood isn't what was there, it's what wasn't. No behavioral problems, no aggression, no concerning conduct. He was praised specifically for being an exemplary child, easygoing, no temper, always kind, helpful, available. His mother said it herself after he pleaded guilty. He didn't have a temper. He was just easygoing like his dad. He's not a monster. And here's the thing. She meant that as a defense. But clinically, no temper is not a psychological health indicator. In someone with this attachment profile, it's a description of a person who has been systematically conditioned to avoid conflict at all costs. The appearance of agreeableness over a building interior reservoir that finds no legitimate outlet. Chris had limited dating history before Shanann, few close friends. He met her when he was 25. And what Shanann offered, what she built, was a relational infrastructure he could inhabit without having to construct one himself. Shanann's Thrive business required a public performance of family wellness. That wasn't incidental, it was structural. Her livelihood depended on projecting domestic abundance, and Chris appeared in that content. He was the co-star, the supportive husband in the videos, the dad in the holiday posts, which means he wasn't just living a private life that was deteriorating, he was publicly performing its continuation. That gap between the performed family and the actual family is doing a lot of work in this case. Because for someone whose entire identity is organized around being perceived as good, the collapse of that public image isn't just embarrassing, it's existential. By 2015, the family filed for bankruptcy. The financial stress was real. The 5-bedroom house, the Thrive business that required constant content production, 2 small children, and a third on the way. But there's no documentation of Chris expressing frustration openly. No fights that friends knew about. No visible cracks. 2018. Chris begins an affair with a co-worker at Anadarko named Nicole Kessinger. And in the prison interview he gives months later, he describes the affair in specific terms. He felt more in control with her, more like himself. That framing is clinically significant. Because what he's saying is that the marriage, the life he'd been inhabiting for years, didn't feel like his life. It felt like a character he was playing. The affair wasn't just about desire, it was about identity. With Kessinger, he could be the version of himself that wasn't defined by Shanann's infrastructure, her social media, her family narrative. He could be autonomous, wanted on his own terms. And then Shanann is 15 weeks pregnant, with a son, Nico. Another child means another 18 years of legal and emotional entanglement. For someone who had already started psychologically exiting the marriage, that pregnancy wasn't a blessing, it was a life sentence. August 11th and 12th, Shanann is in Arizona on a Thrive business trip. Chris has the weekend alone with Bella and Celeste. No documented incident. Friends later say the girls seemed happy. He took them to a birthday party, posted photos. August 13th, 1:48 a.m., Shanann comes home. And what happens next, according to Chris's own confession, is an argument. She's already suspected the affair. She confronts him. He confirms it, tells her he doesn't love her. Her response, "You'll never see your daughters again." Chris describes that threat as the trigger, the thing that made him snap. And for a long time, that narrative held, the crime of passion defense, the husband who lost control in a single catastrophic moment. Except the letter evidence collapses that story completely, because Chris didn't kill Shanann and then, in some extended state of panic, decide to kill the girls to cover it up. He killed the girls first. The argument with Shanann wasn't the trigger. It was the postscript to murders already committed. When she walked through that door at 1:48 a.m., Bella and Celeste were already dead or dying in their beds. Neighbor Nate Trinastich's surveillance camera captures what happens next. Chris backs his truck into the garage, loads something large. The timestamp, early morning, August 13th. Here's the detail that separates planning from improvisation. He loaded his daughters into that truck without their car seats. Those car seats were still in Shanann's car in the garage when police arrived. He drives to the Anadarko oil field where he works. Remote, familiar. He knows the site. He has access. And this is the part of the case that removes every possible interpretive softness. At the oil site, Celeste is still alive. He smothers her with her favorite blanket. Then he forces her body through an 8-inch hatch into a crude oil storage tank. Bella witnesses this. And she says, these are his words from the letter he wrote to author Sherilyn Cadle. "Please, Daddy, don't do to me what you just did to Cece. She was 4 years old. She understood what was about to happen. She pleaded, and he smothered her anyway. Forced her body through the hatch into a second tank. The medical examiner later found scratches on her skin from being pushed through. A tuft of blonde hair caught at the edge. Shanann is buried in a shallow grave nearby. And then Chris Watts goes to work. By noon on August 13th, Nicole Atkinson, the friend who had dropped Shanann off just hours earlier, is trying to reach her. Shanann has missed an OB appointment, missed a business meeting, isn't answering her phone. Nicole goes to the house. No answer. She calls Chris. He says he doesn't know where Shanann is, that they had an emotional conversation, but she left with the kids and he hasn't heard from her since. Nicole calls the Frederick police. At 1:40 p.m., officers arrive for a welfare check. Shanann's purse is inside, her keys, her medication, her phone. Her wedding ring is on the bedside table. Everything that would prove she left voluntarily is still in the house. And Chris is cooperative, calm, lets the officers search the house. He's standing in his own home where he murdered his wife hours earlier, and his affect is flat. Not panicked, not visibly distressed, just present. And then he does something I've genuinely never seen in a case file at this scale. He gives televised interviews. KMGH-TV, KUSA-TV, standing outside his home while investigators with search dogs work the property behind him. Watch the footage if you haven't. He tears up. He appeals to Shanann directly, as if she's watching. He says, "I just want them back. I just want to make things right." And here's what makes it so clinically disturbing. He doesn't look like a bad actor. He looks like someone performing grief who believes the performance. That's not ordinary deception. That's compartmentalization. The ability to maintain two completely incompatible psychological realities simultaneously without destabilization. By August 14th, the FBI and Colorado Bureau of Investigation have joined the case. And they're not looking for a missing family. They're building a homicide case. August 15th, Chris Watts takes a polygraph. He fails, completely. And when investigators tell him that, something shifts. He asks to speak to his father, Ronnie, and he confesses. But the confession is a lie. He tells his father and then investigators that he strangled Shanann, yes, but only after he came home and found her murdering the girls. He says he saw it on the baby monitor, came upstairs, saw Shanann strangling Celeste, and he snapped, killed her in a rage of protective defense. This false confession is worth treating as a psychological document, because he didn't claim a stranger broke in. He didn't say it was an accident. He cast Shanann as the killer and himself as the reactive defender. He externalized the agency, inverted his role. He needed to be the father who snapped in defense of his children, not the father who killed them. That narrative construction reveals something about how he needed to see himself, even in confession. Ronnie believed him. He said later, "The way he looked at me, the way he was crying, I believed it." Chris Watts is arrested on August 15th, 2018. That night, investigators recover the bodies. Shanann in the shallow grave, Bella and Celeste submerged in crude oil. August 21st, Chris is formally charged. 3 counts of first-degree murder, 2 additional counts for killing children under 12 by someone in a position of trust, 1 count of unlawful termination of pregnancy for Nico, 3 counts of tampering with deceased human bodies, 9 counts total. Shanann's family, her parents, Frank and Sandra Rusek, make a request. They don't want the death penalty. They don't want more death. They want it over. The defense has no case. The surveillance footage exists. The bodies were recovered exactly where Chris said they'd be once he recanted the false confession. His phone data, his Google searches, the timeline, all of it confirms premeditation. November 6th, 2018, Chris Watts pleads guilty to all 9 counts. November 19th, sentencing, 5 life terms without parole, 3 consecutive, 2 concurrent, 48 additional years for the unlawful termination of pregnancy, 36 years for tampering with the bodies. There is no trial, no evidentiary hearing. The guilty plea means the public never hears forensic psychologists testify, never hears the full scope of evidence. It's over in 3 months from arrest to sentencing. December 2018, Chris is transferred out of Colorado to Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin. Security concerns. Child killers are the most hated category of inmate in prison hierarchies. He'd been receiving death threats. And then, from prison, Chris starts talking. He gives an extended interview to CBI investigators. He writes letters to an author named Sherilyn Cadle. And what he says in those letters is where the case stops being a crime story and becomes something else. Because this is where he admits the truth. So what was this actually? Here's where I have to be honest. The framework most people apply to this case, the idea that this was a crime of passion, that Chris Watts snapped in a fight and then panicked, is wrong. The letter evidence dismantles it completely. In a letter to Sherilyn Cadle, Chris wrote, August 12th, when I finished putting the girls to bed, I walked away and said, that's the last time I'm going to be tucking my babies in. I knew what was going to happen the day before, and I did nothing to stop it. The night before, he stood at a threshold and consciously chose not to step back. He wrote, all the weeks of me thinking about killing her, and now I was faced with it. All the weeks. This was not a crime of passion that escalated in a bedroom argument. This was the terminal event in a weeks-long cognitive process. During those weeks, Chris Watts went to work, appeared in Shanann's videos, took the girls to birthday parties, and every night he was running a mental rehearsal of a plan he had already committed to. That is not impulsivity. That is not reactive violence. That is a decision that had already been made, waiting for the execution date. So how does someone do that? How does a person inhabit two completely incompatible realities? The loving husband in the social media content, the premeditated family annihilator in private, without falling apart? The answer is a defense mechanism called compartmentalization, and Chris Watts is one of the most vivid demonstrations of it in the public crime record. Compartmentalization is the ability to wall off emotional material so completely that it doesn't contaminate the presenting persona. It's not just lying, it's structural. You maintain multiple self-states simultaneously, and they're kept in separate psychological chambers so they don't interact. The surveillance footage shows a man loading his murdered family into a truck with the same effect you'd see loading groceries. The TV interview shows a man performing grief so convincingly that his own father believed him. These aren't just duplicitous behaviors. They suggest a personality structure in which emotional access was already so limited that even homicide didn't dramatically alter the surface presentation. Clinically, what we're looking at is consistent with factor 1 psychopathy, the interpersonal and affective features, shallow affect, manipulative presentation, lack of genuine remorse, the ability to perform emotion without generating it. But here's what makes Watts unusual. He has no factor 2, no criminal history, no impulsivity, no chronic behavioral dysregulation. He held steady employment, had no violence in his past, was described by everyone as reliable and calm. Factor 1 without factor 2 means you're looking at someone with significant affective deficits, the inability to feel what most people feel, operating inside what looks from the outside like a completely normal, functional life. That's rarer than the full spectrum psychopath, and it's more dangerous in some ways because there's no behavioral warning system, no escalating violence, no criminal record to flag, just a calm, agreeable man who one day decides his family is an obstacle and eliminates them with the same emotional register as filing paperwork. So how did this architecture get built? The developmental history gives us some threads. Chris was raised to be easygoing, to avoid conflict, to suppress negative emotion. His father was described as unemotional, a model Chris learned from. His mother praised him specifically for having no temper. And here's where we have to talk about something that most coverage of this case completely misses. The people pleaser profile. Chris Watts spent his entire life being rewarded for not expressing anger, not engaging in conflict, always being helpful and agreeable. And the clinical literature on chronic emotional suppression is very clear. The complete avoidance of conflict does not neutralize negative affect. It stores it. Think of it like a pressure vessel with no safety valve. Over years of a financially stressed, relationship-strained marriage, without direct communication, without confrontation, without any functional mechanism for expressing resentment, the pressure builds. And when the confrontation finally arrives, there's no graduated conflict management capacity to draw on. The reaction isn't the culmination of a domestic violence pattern. It's the explosion of something that had no other exit route. The affair with Nicole Kessinger wasn't just about sex or desire. It was about identity. Chris said he felt more like himself with her, more in control. What he's describing is narcissistic supply, the validation of being wanted on his own terms, not as the supporting character in Shanann's production. And that distinction matters, because Chris Watts isn't a grandiose narcissist. He's a covert one. Covert narcissism is characterized by chronic feelings of inadequacy beneath a compliant, agreeable surface. The identity is organized entirely around being perceived as good, and when that perception is threatened, when the mask is about to come off, the response isn't loud rage, it's cold elimination. Shanann's Lavelle Thrive business required the public performance of an ideal family. That wasn't just a backdrop to this case, it was structurally load bearing. Because Chris wasn't just privately exiting a marriage, he was publicly performing its continuation. And for someone whose entire self concept depends on being seen as the good guy, the collapse of that public image wasn't just embarrassing, it was existential. Divorce would have meant the complete destruction of the only identity he knew how to inhabit publicly. And then Shanann is 15 weeks pregnant. Another child means another 18 years of entanglement. For a covert narcissist experiencing the relationship as an identity cage, that pregnancy wasn't a blessing. It was a permanent lock on the door. So here's the intersection. Covert narcissism, where exposure equals identity death, plus extreme conflict avoidance with no template for direct confrontation, plus weeks of premeditation that had already normalized the murders in his mind, plus a pregnancy making the exit permanent, plus Shanann's custody threat arriving into a psychology that had already decided elimination was the only available control mechanism. It wasn't just one thing, it was the collision of all of them at once. And then there's Bella, 4 years old, watching her father kill her sister, pleading with him, "Please, Daddy, don't do to me what you just did to Cece." In the letter, Chris wrote, "She knew what I was doing." He acknowledged her awareness, he heard her plead, and he killed her anyway. He wrote that he couldn't believe how easily her body dropped through the hatch into the oil. The phrase that stands out is "how easily." He had expected difficulty. What registered wasn't horror at what he'd done, it was surprise at the ease of doing it. That is not the language of someone overwhelmed by events. That is the language of someone narrating a task. 5 life terms, no parole, he'll die in prison. Chris Watts now reportedly keeps photos of Shanann and the girls in his cell. He says he speaks to them every morning and evening. He reads books to his daughters at night. The same performative grief loop that drove the TV interviews, now running privately on a daily schedule. Shanann was 34, 15 weeks pregnant. Bella was 4, Celeste was 3. They were loved, they were known, and they were erased by someone who had decided, weeks in advance, that they were obstacles. Here's the question I can't answer, and I don't think anyone can. In the prison letters, Chris describes the weeks of planning. The night before, saying goodbye to the girls, knowing what he was about to do. The moment Bella pleaded with him. And through all of it, he provides aesthetic details, logistical observations, and self-referential discomfort. But he never describes feeling what you or I would feel. So the question is this, does he actually feel it now, the weight of what he took? Or is the prison persona, the father reading to his dead daughters every night, just another performance in a long line of performances, played for an audience of one? I don't know, and that might be the most disturbing part of the whole case.